This episode of Chains is sponsored exclusively by Charlie Foxtrot Brewing. Ask about beers from this veteran-owned brewery in tap rooms across Southwest Florida and Western North Carolina. Thank you for supporting our veterans. Chains, Part 22, written by Dustin Dhonash, narrated by Lucy Hillman. I turned my flashlight off for my eyes to adjust. I squinted in the darkness, trying to pick up any light, but it was pitch dark. There was a faint itch starting in my lungs. The dampness and cold was starting to get to me. My injuries were starting to sting and ache. Exhaustion was catching up to me, too. I knew the longer I spent waiting in the darkness, the closer I'd get to the pain and fatigue. I had to get back out of my head, out of this stupid tunnel. I flicked the flashlight on and pointed where I knew the hole in the concrete basement was. Immediately, I heard someone running behind me. I gripped the oversized cleaver and spun around, but it was too late. He tackled me at full speed. We fell to the ground. The flashlight went spinning out of my hand, illuminating the whole area in a whirl for a brief moment before landing in the dirt facing the dismantled brick opening of the basement. He had tumbled a bit further than me in the fall, and the light was pointing in his direction. I, however, was no worse off, save for being on the ground. I got up before him and had a mind to use the cleaver on him. So I did. Any mercy or doubt that I may have had was gone. I knew it was him or me. I rushed him immediately and ran into his foot he'd lifted just in time. I wanted to thwack his head, but I settled for the leg he'd so generously offered. I swung the cleaver down with both hands, and it wedged into his thigh, just above the knee. He roared with pain, and with my momentum pulled me over him into the neatly stacked bricks that had once made up the wall of the basement. I fell flat on my back into several of the pointed stone corners. I knew that in any other case, that amount of pain would have stopped me in my tracks, but this was different. I growled through my pain, shifted my weight off of the bricks, and willed myself back to my feet. He took his hands off his bleeding leg for a moment as I approached him. I pinned one arm by kneeling down on it and took my chances against the other with a strong overhead swing. The knife took a large chunk out of the left side of his forehead. With his other arm, he held the cleaver close to him so that I couldn't pull back to swing again. As I pulled away to get out of his grasp, the gap widened and left just enough space for another short swing down onto his head. He was out. I took another swing at his head. I didn't want to have to deal with him again. I caught my breath and waited for some existential crisis to come over me for hurting this man, but I felt nothing for him. I heard some footsteps further down the underground tunnel, so I grabbed the flashlight and climbed to the spiral stone steps. The heat coming off of the metal door at the top of the steps was alarming. I pushed my back up against the stone wall and used the cleaver to push open the scalding door. The smoke billowed in, and the heat was intense. I backed away down the stairs a bit. From what I could see, in spite of the heat, the fire had burned itself out. All that was left was embers and smoke. I decided that I'd rather take my chances with the heat than whoever was coming down that tunnel. After the smoke finished flooding the room, I ran into the barn. All of the makeshift plywood rooms had burned away. The small kitchen area, the room with the couch where I saw Chris, and the stall where I started the fire, all of it was gone. I walked out into the larger staging area of the barn and saw that one of the large doors was open. The snow had turned back into a cold rain and was falling in heavy, loud drops onto the ground. The fresh, peaty air was a welcome change. I could hear people outside of the barn to my left, in the direction of my drainpipe hiding spot. The sight of a burned and dirty body laying there just outside the wide opening of the cattle door startled me. It had blended in with the ground. I could tell from his injuries that it was Mr. P. I joked silently to myself that distinguishing people by their injuries was the new normal in this hellhole. I moved past him and turned right, determined to climb high enough to see over the gate, to see Chris. Pulling myself up the steep hill was made easier by the saplings that were clinging into the soil. It seemed like a barn would be better placed in a large open area. This one seemed almost hemmed in by the large hill that I was climbing. It seemed especially strange that the larger doors would open onto that side. I dismissed the thoughts as I worked my way up the wet, red soil. Nothing about this place had made sense so far. Why was I still wondering about their motives? Why would their barn placement make sense? Why was I even thinking about barn placement? At the expense of a few well-rooted saplings, I got to the top of the steep incline and onto relatively level ground. It was all mush. Despite what would normally be an earth-shattering series of events for me, I felt okay. The injuries seemed minor, though I'd probably have a more difficult time with them in the coming days. I pressed on uphill until I could see a small lamppost by the front gate. From there, I moved through the woods, breaking some small vines as I went until I had an angle on the front gate where Chris was. A pit opened up in my stomach. He was gone. If they had him, it meant that they'd continue with whatever torture they'd begun with his caged arm. He was in such terrible shape by the time we had gotten to him, that I doubted he could have made much progress on his own. I rolled my eyes at the thought of Chastity swooping in heroically to save boring old Chris. I guessed that was better than him dying. At least a little. With few good options, I decided to head into the woods. I figured a neighbor wouldn't be more than a mile away. I could call the police from there. Plus, the rain had stopped again. I kept my light off until I was far enough away that no one on the farm could see. Just out of the woodline, there was a chain-link fence, one of the sturdy ones that's dug into the ground. I futilely tugged at a few spots before giving up and walking next to it. A few minutes of that revealed a hole that looked like it had been cut. I passed through it and onto a section of concrete. It reached further than my flashlight would show. My best guess was that it had once been part of a building. Walking on the concrete was so much easier than on the loose, wet soil. I was glad for the change, plus my eyes had adjusted. Even with the cloudy, starless sky, there was enough light. Being this far away from the insanity put me at ease, which meant that all of the feeling of exhaustion, injuries, and cold weather were starting to creep their way back in. I had walked less than a minute before I started feeling heavy. I flicked the flashlight, but it was useless. A fog had drifted in. It was moving fast, down into the valley. As soon as I saw it, I could feel the cool mist on my skin and I started to shiver. I decided it would be better not to see the onslaught of freezing droplets and turned the flashlight back off. It was starting to get miserably cold, and I was feeling even heavier from exhaustion. I moved faster to compensate, reasoning that I'd be safe and warm soon. Suddenly, the ground in front of me had disappeared. I flailed helplessly, trying to keep my balance, but my momentum carried me over the edge. I was falling. My arm hit the opposite side, knocking me sideways. I landed quickly, but on one leg, and sprained my ankle. It wasn't broken, but it had already started to swell. The pain seared through the exhaustion, and I was fully alert again. Just in time, I joked darkly to myself as I scooted up against the wall. As I did, pain shot through my arm as well, though it wasn't nearly as bad as my ankle. I had fallen into a stairwell, probably something left over from the building that used to be here. It was about 5 feet wide and 10 feet deep and ended at a metal door. Even the slightest weight on my injured ankle was too much to bear. The stairs seemed impossible. I reached over and slid the metal bar on the door to open it. It was just as cold inside, but there was no wind and no fast-moving fog. I decided to rest in here for the moment. I pushed the door wide and half crawled, half threw myself over the raised metal door frame. The door swung shut behind me. I flicked the flashlight on to see where I was. As far as I could tell, I was in a decrepit walk-in freezer. It was roughly 10 by 10 and had a door opposite the one I had just used. There were several sets of shelves and a workstation. It seemed an okay place for now. I forced myself up and into the chair at the workstation. There was an old leather binder with the letters H-RA printed on the front in gold letters. It used one of those swooping, over-stylized fonts that must have seemed futuristic at the time, but was now a sure sign of the past. I opened it to the first dog-eared page. It had several handwritten notes with dates and was titled Phase 5, Safe Storage and Disposal. One of the notes above the title read, To be completed before cold room demo, 6/8, Thursday. Under it was another note in different handwriting that said, Demolition impossible due to budget changes. Cold room and storage will be left in situ. Eager to do something other than linger in pain, I read about how this company would supply, store, and dispose of mercury-based dental work. I had no idea why a manufacturing company would be this far out in the country. I was shaken out of my pain-motivated research by a strange sound. Coming from the door opposite the one I'd entered was the sound of a dog barking. I leapt up, forgetting about my ankle, and immediately fell to the ground. The ache in my already throbbing and swollen joint doubled as I flopped over onto my side, clutching it. I hoped that doing so could make up for the fact that I'd just nearly put my full weight down. It didn't. It was a few minutes before the pain subsided. The strained barking continued. I used the chair to pull myself back up and wheeled it over to the door to look through the small window. It didn't make sense for a dog to be underground, but sure enough, in the back of that room, there was a dog chained to the wall. I didn't see any food or water, and the whole area was covered in filth. The rest of the larger room was filled entirely with shelves that had small labeled jars on them. Even if I couldn't save Chris, I could at least save this